Also, I think there's a big misconception, and this happens a lot, is people think that the first step is to go out and get your home study and your clearances, but they don't realize that those expire and what that means and what the context is. Yes. And so I think people do that first. So again, I prefer that maybe they come and talk to me. But the other reason I also love when a person or couple comes to me first is I can then set them up with the ancillary professionals that would be of benefit to them from inception. So they can come to me and talk through what's going on, but maybe that's the perfect time to introduce them to you.
Your dream is to become a mom. My dream is to help you get there. I'm Rebecca Gruenspan, a single mom through domestic adoption and an adoption consultant for over a decade. I'll be your guide, along with other adoption professionals and members of the adoption constellation, walking you step by step down this beautiful and complex path of adopting your baby. When I was going through the adoption process, I had no idea what I was doing, what I needed to know, or more importantly, who to trust. Well, after helping hundreds and hundreds of families grow through the beauty and complexity of adoption, I've learned more than a thing or two, and let me tell you, it's not always rainbows and butterflies. This isn't just another podcast sharing adoption stories, but it's for you if you're genuinely committed to diving in with an open heart, eager to learn everything there is to know about adopting a baby so that you can show up for yourself and your child in the best way possible. This podcast is for you if you're ready to put your newfound knowledge into action. Adoption isn't for the weak of heart, and it certainly isn't done when your baby gets placed in your arms. If that's what you think, I'm afraid you're living in la la land. My promise to you is to keep it real if you promise to keep digging. We'll acknowledge the hard, and we'll also celebrate the joy that is adoption. You ready? Let's do this. Welcome to today's episode of the Adoption Roadmap Podcast. Today, we're digging into the law, adoption law. My guest for today, Diana Schimmel, is a seasoned family lawyer serving Greater Philadelphia and South Central Jersey. Diana's journey into family law began with a desire to directly impact lives. As a former child advocate attorney in Philadelphia, she was inspired by the joy of matching children with families, leading her to specialize in adoption law. Now, a third of her practice focuses on adoptive parents and kinship adoptions. Diana is the chair of the Adoption Subcommittee for the Philadelphia Bar Association and is also involved with helpusadopt.org, an organization that provides grants to hopeful adoptive families. Diana's impressive credentials include a Juris Doctorate from Widener University and a string of accolades like the Pennsylvania Super Lawyers Rising Stars list. Outside of her legal career, Diana is a devoted mother to 2 little girls and perhaps on some days more importantly, a lover of clean wine. Join us as we explore the legalities of adoption with Diana Schimmel. Welcome, Diana. I want to just jump right in, if that's okay with you, and ask your first question.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited about this podcast that you've started and getting to be a guest.
Yeah, awesome. So personally, you haven't adopted. So how did you get into adoptions, and how do you feel best suited to support the families you work with?
That's a really great question, and one that I somewhat come to when I meet a new set of clients with a twinge of what are they going to say about that. But I came to it because at the very beginning of my career, I started as a law clerk for a juvenile dependency judge. And a lot of termination of parental rights cases came before her, and I was there at all of those hearings. I was the one managing the paperwork, the orders, and then, of course, whenever there was an appeal, I was the one writing those opinions. So I started seeing the adoption process from the public foster care system side. And then when I went into private practice, Adoption is a niche within a niche. Family law is a niche in the law in and of itself, and adoption is even smaller. So I started getting referrals from colleagues because no one knew at all the process. And at least in Pennsylvania, the process for public and private adoption starts the same way. And I really enjoyed seeing what I saw through the foster care system, where perhaps reunification wasn't an option, but adoption was, and how it impacted those children and how it impacted those families. So initially, I came to this with a knowledge of both sides of that process and an understanding of not only private, but also public adoption. And so when my clients come to me, I'm uniquely situated, not because of my personal experience building my own family, but because of my professional experience. I don't think that there are many practitioners in my area of the country that have done everything from all facets, who have worked as the child advocate attorney representing the child, who have done the behind the scenes with the judge in chambers, who have done private work and understand the nuance of the juvenile dependency system, but have also worked with family members, kinship, second parent, step parent, adoptive parents, in a lot of different capacities to navigate the public system. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of overlap in Pennsylvania specifically with how that process starts.
So how do you think having that full background and all of that knowledge gives you a leg up and maybe specifically benefits your client, the hopeful or the adoptive parent?
I think it benefits them because I'm able to give them an understanding of all facets. I think a lot of people come to the adoption process with a whole mix of emotions.
Yeah.
Number one, they're overwhelmed. I think they don't know where to start. They don't know where to look. They don't know what their options are. They see a lot on the internet or what they've heard from friends and relatives. So I really like to look at myself like the quarterback. When a prospective couple or person comes to me, I'm able to give them an understanding of each different avenue. So I really think that giving them all of those options while managing their potential overwhelm at the same time helps them make the most informed decision for them and how they want to build their family.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So tell us what an adoption lawyer's role is specifically in domestic private adoption through an agency. And at what point in the journey should a family seek out an attorney?
Sure. I view my role, like I mentioned, as sort of the quarterback. A lot of people haven't selected an agency that they want to work with when they come to me. So I look at my role as effectively the relationship builder. So a prospective couple comes to me and says, we'd like to pursue adoption to build our family. So I sit down with them and we go through, what does private adoption through the foster care system look like? What are the pros and cons based on your goals of that system? Then I go through and I tell them about the agencies that I have had experience with and built relationships with, and give them some topics of contemplation. Do they want a large agency with multiple offices and a nationwide advertising reach? Or do they want a local one that's boutique who handles only 5 to 10 clients and families at a time? So I walk through with them those options. I explain to them the timeline. I explain to them the home study process. I explain to them the benefits of working with someone like you and your agency, a consultant, of understanding what financial resources there are for them, of helping them understand their goals. Because sometimes people come to the adoption process thinking, well, I just want a healthy baby. Well, what does that really mean to you? Do you understand what drug exposure means? So you don't? Oh, well, here, go watch this webinar that is being hosted that, a colleague and trusted friend of mine is hosting. So I look at my role really as their touchstone initially. And then I make those connections between the agencies, the consultants, the ancillary professionals. Where I come back around, obviously, is once we start drafting legal pleadings. Is it a pre-birth order? Is it a petition for adoption? Do we need to get a birth certificate and get that all in the works. I think a lot of people think that the attorneys only come in at the very end. Also, some agencies try to manage the legality of it in-house. But one of the main things that I have found is that there's always an advocate for birth parent. There's always an advocate for, the adoptee. But there is not always a true advocate for the adoptive parent or resource. And so a lot of times I view myself as their true advocate. They certainly trust an agency or trust, a social worker, but they don't have anybody who they feel like they can honestly speak to who only is thinking of their best interest. And that's the role that I view myself in.
I look at a consultant as somebody who's there solely for the hopeful adoptive parent. And so that's interesting to hear you say that. My guess is that when you're working with an attorney through an agency, like if an agency just kind of rolls it all in together, that you probably could go to that attorney and they would be your advocate. But a lot of people don't realize that because it gets a little blurry because it's within the agency.
Right.
Would you agree?
Totally agree. Yeah. And I've had clients tell me specifically that while they appreciated that advice and that information that attorney was providing them, they still felt like there was this allegiance, for lack of a better word, with the birth mother or the birth parents. So they felt like even the advice that they were getting was somewhat skewed and there wasn't really somebody who was only talking to them. And the other piece is there isn't always a resource with an agency. And I think this is something you and I have in common, to go over some of the legalities and the complexities. Like if a profile comes up and the birth mother resides and is going to give birth in New Mexico, and they have some specs about an unknown potential father, they, aren't necessarily getting prenatal care, the adoptive family may come to me and want to talk through that potential match. So one of the things I provide, in addition to obviously the risk factors of just the biographical information, is, in New Mexico, we often see more issue with ICWA. And is there a hang up in that law? Is, ICPC conciliatory with New Jersey or Pennsylvania more so than any other state? And I can share with them my experience and say, look, in the past, I've seen more red tape in that state, or there's less of a clarity in the law in this area. And that's something else that I provide to my clients when they're deciding to throw their hat in the ring to potentially get matched.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I want to talk about multi-state later. You mentioned ICWA and ICPC. Do you want to explain what those are?
Sure. So ICWA deals with Indigenous families and tribes. So we want to be conscious and cautious, and there are laws surrounding the fact that if a child to be born and adopted is a member of an Indigenous tribe, there are a specific set of laws and rules that we need to comply with in order to ensure that we're not impeding on the rights of that Indigenous tribe. And ICPC is the Interstate Compact for the Placement of Children. And the idea behind it is we're not trying to traffic children across state lines. So when a child is born in a particular state, that state needs to speak with the state where the adopting parents reside and will reside with the child to ensure that everybody's on board and understands that child born in state A is going to move and live in state B, and everything's done above board.
And by the way, there's usually like one person in each state who does that. So people often ask, well, how long is it going to take? How do you know? Is there anything you can do? And I explain, well, it depends. Are they on vacation? Is it a holiday? Does it happen on a Friday? Like, you have one person that you're relying on. And if they have a whole stack of them, you're going to wait a little bit longer. And there's really not a whole lot you can do.
Exactly. I'm managing one right now in California. So she emails me at 5 o'clock my time, but it's really, earlier in the day, 2 o'clock her time, the height of her afternoon. And so even that adds to the delay. I'm sending her things, she's sending me things on a 3-hour time difference.
Yep. And that happens all the time. ICWA stands for Indian Child Welfare Act, just specifically. All right. So one of the other things I wanted to mention is something that we have added. We've added a top tier kind of program level of service. And one of the things that we now offer is for an adoption attorney to look at somebody's match and look at the contract for the agency that they match with, just so that they can put eyes on it. And like you said, talk about the things that could come up, or that they should go back and ask that agency to make sure that they've thought XYZ through. Most of the time, it's going to be smooth sailing. But number one, it's peace of mind to have an attorney just look at that and lay eyes on it. And number two, there will be things sometimes that you haven't thought about or that you should question ahead of time, just to make sure that it all goes smoothly.
I think that's fantastic. I think that's really fantastic. That's something that I do for my clients, and I think it's huge. I think a lot of times we get bogged down in the legalese, and having that as an available resource through your, consultancy, through me, whoever it is, I think that's a huge service. And people don't realize that some of this isn't as, obvious as you would think that it is.
Yeah. So you think somebody should come to you at the very beginning of their journey, or when they match? When do you think is the best time?
Sure. So I think that it depends on what the prospective adoptive family or person's goals are. So if they have already decided that they don't want to pursue public adoption, or they've already decided that they want to use an agency and they know sort of more of where they're going, or they've selected an agency specifically already, then they can come to me at that point in the process, and we can decide, do they feel comfortable proceeding with that agency and then getting me back involved at the end of it. I think where I talk about getting involved at the very beginning, that's for the person or couple who really doesn't have any understanding of the process and who really wants to try and focus their decision making. Also, I think there's a big misconception, and this happens a lot, is people think that the first step is to go out and get your home study and your clearances, but they don't realize that those expire and what that means and what the context is. Yes. And so I think people do that first. So again, I prefer that maybe they come and talk to me. But the other reason I also love when a person or couple comes to me first is I can then set them up with the ancillary professionals that would be of benefit to them from inception. So they can come to me and talk through what's going on, but maybe that's the perfect time to introduce them to you. Or it's the perfect time to introduce them to a counselor, or, it's time to talk with them about getting their clearances. In New Jersey, we have to go through an agency. So they benefit from talking to me earlier, because then they can start to form those ancillary professional relationships sooner.
I love that. And I talk about building your team and really putting people in place that you trust, because in adoption, especially if you look online, and I encourage looking online for a lot of reasons, but you're going to get a lot of opinions about what you should do. And you need to put a team in place that puts your blinders on, so that you are just focusing on what they have to tell you and lead you. There are a lot of people out there who say, first go get your home study. And I'm like, no, you're like flushing money down the toilet if you don't have the rest of it in place yet. And people just want to get started, so they get anxious, and they know that, yes, legally that's the first step. But if you don't have everything else in place and you don't know where you're going after that, then it can become a problem later and waste a lot of your money.
Absolutely.
So all of that said, let's just hit upon what an identified adoption is, and then how you come into play with that.
Sure. So sometimes couples or families will come to me and they have made a personal connection with a family member, family friend, with a member of their church or religious community. So perfect example is I had a client come to me recently and they said, our family friend just had a baby, and they weren't expecting it. She didn't realize that she was pregnant until third trimester. She's very young, unequipped, really wants to place. So my clients and I talked through what needed to happen. Did they need to get an attorney in California where this child was going to be born? Did they need to start things here in New Jersey to, get the ball rolling? So what we did was put a plan in place to decide, are we going to file the adoption pleading here in New Jersey? Are we going to do surrenders in New Jersey or California? Are we going to have you fly out and, receive the child there and stay? Is it both of you that's going to stay? Or one of you going to come back? Do you understand what the interstate process is going to look like? So we really talked through everything, and we ultimately made the decision in that particular case that we were going to file the interstate compact in California. We were going to have them communicate and approve in Jersey and come back here to solidify the adoption itself in New Jersey. But we ultimately had the biological parents both sign their surrenders in California so that it was done as timely as possible. And a requirement in Jersey is if you are signing a surrender that's Jersey, under Jersey law, you have to actually physically be in the state of New Jersey to do so. And in that case, we didn't want to fly biological parents across the country just to sign. So we made those strategic legal decisions together.
Interesting. That gets into a whole can get into a whole discussion. We'll talk about in a little bit. I'm just thinking about the ethics and the questions about following different laws and why somebody would fly from one state to another and all of that. And there's a lot of discussion and a lot of opinions on that. So you had mentioned that you have connections with all these other, attorneys, agencies, social workers, whatever in the adoption world. Mm-hmm. How have you built those? Like, how do you have all those connections?
That's a great question. So it came about first from my time as a child advocate attorney here. So in the juvenile dependency system in Pennsylvania, there are a variety of agencies who are contracted by our Department of Human Services. So I formed relationships with some of those social workers there and stayed in touch. The other piece was I started, when I started having people approach me with already identified matches, they were already working with about three to four agencies in my local area here in the greater Philadelphia, southern New Jersey area. So I started making outreach to those agencies just to introduce myself. And what I started finding was that the different players in the adoption arena were sort of living on islands. And what I mean by that is the attorneys all knew each other and the agencies all knew each other, but nobody was really making these relationships across the aisle. So when I was introduced to Becky Fawcett, who started Help Us Adopt, I approached her with an idea to create a adoption professionals council. It's something I had done at Penn University. They have a child welfare organization there where they cross the interdisciplines of law, social work, and medicine. So I thought, why can't this work in the adoption arena? So what I was proposing was a consortium of lawyers, social workers, agencies, advocates, consultants, nonprofits, all with their interests in the adoption community to connect us, and not just locally, because my reach at that point was really only New Jersey and Pennsylvania and some in New York. But I wanted this to be like a nationwide thing because I started noticing again that my client was coming to me saying, well, my intended potential match is in Georgia and I don't know anyone down there. So what started was a quarterly virtual meetup. We started a Facebook group. We, started doing what we could do to connect through obviously the touchstone of Help Us Adopt. And the group itself took on varying forms, but what really started happening was now I had a Rolodex, for lack of a better word, when a client would come to me looking for resources. And recently, and I know this was someone I spoke with you about, I had a single woman who really had the cards stacked against her in terms of being able to match. And she said, look, this is my last chance to become a mother. I just want to throw everything out there. So I reached out to almost, 9 or 10 resources that I specifically had, knew were reliable and vetted from the Help Us Adopt Professionals Council, and started connecting her. So I started establishing those relationships, and really keeping up with those relationships has been a huge help. And also I've carved a bit of a niche for myself in contested adoptions. And so I've gotten to know surrogates in the courthouse, specific judges, clerks, and I've really bonded with them through those unique scenarios. And that has also been a way to keep up. And it ultimately has been wonderful, because even just about a half an hour before I hopped on here with you, I got a call from the surrogate over in Camden County, New Jersey, about a very unique case of mine where we were retroactively doing the interstate compact. And I think it would have raised a few more eyebrows if it wasn't me being the one to file it. And I think my credibility and reputation gave them the comfort of knowing, okay, we trust the work that she's doing and trust what she's putting forward. But it's just about maintaining those relationships now once I've built them over the years.
Yeah, so good. I was on that council for a little while with Help Us Adopt. Is that where we originally met?
I think so, yes.
Oh, okay, great. Which is great. And you're right. The attorneys and the agencies, they don't always cross those lines. And I go to conferences with the Quad A attorneys, which is the American Adoption
Academy
Association of Attorneys. And then I also go to the larger adoption conferences, like through the National Council for Adoption or whatever, where very few attorneys attend, but the attorney group is super tight. And the agency and social worker group are a little bit more cliquey and kind of stay within their own states, and they don't like to cross boundaries. And it's interesting because I often tell the agencies and attorneys, I say to anyone, if you want to know what's going on in adoption across the country, call me. Because I work with people across the country. You are working in your silo, and most people are not like you, where they have those relationships all across the country. And it is very important, like in any business, to really nurture those relationships. It goes really far. Yeah.
And I think it's funny, when I was mentioning that client with the unique scenario, I started with one of my local agencies, and they were very boutique, and they really only were working with 5 to 10 families at a time, and they had a wait list. But they recommended Paige Nipfer to me. And then Paige thought to mention you. And then someone mentioned Pear Tree. And then I thought, oh, well, these are all my same group. Like everybody's talking in the same context, which is great. And again, nurturing that and having those relationships. And I think at the end of the day, it benefits our clients, because then it creates a smaller community. Everybody's working together, and it helps, them at the end of the day.
Before we go on, we're going to take a quick break, but don't go away. We still have so much to talk about. The Adoption Roadmap podcast is sponsored by the Adoption Roadmap Academy, the only online program of its kind for hopeful adoptive parents like you who want step-by-step guidance, preparing for your home study, creating a compelling adoption profile book, choosing the right agencies, and more, so that you can bring your baby home sooner. As an adoption consultant and adoptive mom who's been where you are, I'm going to guide you step by step through everything you need to know about the domestic infant adoption journey, from home study to finalization. And the great part is, you get to do it at your own pace with a supportive community behind you. The Adoption Roadmap Academy is a step-by-step guide to domestic infant adoption for hopeful individuals and families who are sick and tired of waiting forever. It's the first and only self-paced, adoption consultant-led program that shows you exactly how to navigate the domestic adoption process from home study to finalization. With our proven 4-step adoption roadmap model, you're going to be able to save time you can't make up, hours and weeks and even months of tedious legwork and research are done for you. You're going to be able to go at your own pace. No matter what else is going on in life, nobody's going to be breathing down your throat. You are going to be able to gain and keep momentum because everything is going to be spoon-fed for you in exactly the way you need. You are going to possibly even save money by knowing how to vet situations and working with the right agencies. It could save you a lot of heartache. You are going to be able to access this course anytime, anywhere, and get expert guidance and support, not only by me, but also by an amazing community who know exactly what you are walking through. So if you're interested in starting your adoption journey and ready to fast forward and simplify your domestic adoption process, please email the word academy to support@rgadoptionconsulting.com today, and we'll get you started. I want to give people a little bit of a window into what these adoption laws look like. Mm-hmm. And I think what specifically resonates and is most important with adoptive parents and hopeful parents is when mom can sign and when revocation is. Can you talk a little bit about the laws in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and if there's something else besides those two parts of the law that you think is also really important for people to know? Let's talk about that too.
Absolutely. I think those two pieces are critical. I think there's a big misconception about when surrenders can happen and when consent and voluntary relinquishment can happen. And one of the things in both of the states that I practice that is interesting is that if an agency is licensed in that particular state, you can take advantage of that state's laws. So there are several agencies that I work with who are licensed in a variety of places. So when a parent comes to them, whether it's an intended parent or a prospective adoptive parent, they talk them through choice of law. And that's where I've found also is super important for me to get involved. So in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey, relinquishment can happen at the same time. It's 72 hours after birth. So there is a requirement that nothing can happen before that time, no matter what. So often if there is an intended plan, there's been the required counseling, everybody knows what's happening, but prior to relinquishment, if birth mom says, I don't want to hold the baby, I don't want the baby in my room, I want to be able to give adoptive mom skin to skin immediately, we put those plans in place. But one of the unique distinctions between Pennsylvania and New Jersey is revocation. So if a child is placed for adoption with an adoptive family through an agency, that is irrevocable. There is, once relinquishments are signed, once surrenders are signed, there is no opportunity for that birth parent to change their mind. And that's through an agency specifically. Now, in Pennsylvania, regardless of agency, regardless of independent placement, there is a 30-day revocation window. And that revocation has to be specifically in writing. And they are very, very, very strict about that 30-day period and the notice requirement for the 30-day period and understanding what you're signing at that time. So that's a really big piece. One of the other things I think that people need to consider and do consider when choosing a venue in our local area is cost of expenses for birth mother or birth father.
Hold on. Before we go into cost, I want to go back for a second about the 30 days. So in one state, you have 3 days and then it's irrevocable and she can't change her mind. In another state, you have, she can change her mind up to 30 days. So you can have baby for 29 days and then she can step forward for any reason, correct?
For any
reason. She doesn't have to prove anything. She doesn't have, so, I'm curious from your standpoint, which you think is better for mom, for biological mom, if you think one is better than the other. I'm curious. I have my own thoughts.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think one is better, but I've heard the arguments on both sides. So the argument for irrevocable consent is that it's already an extremely emotional and difficult decision to decide to match your child and place with an adoptive resource. So having to have it hang over your head and not have finality with that decision after those initial 3 days, that can be very concerning for some. Now, for others on the other side of it, it allows for more contemplation and thought over the decision so that you're not just distraught in those initial few days postpartum. But what I think both states do to mitigate both sides of those arguments is there's a lot of counseling and required, work to be done with a therapist or with a social worker. Of course, not everyone gets that, and not everyone gets that understanding. But that's why in New Jersey, it's specifically irrevocable only with agency placement. So it's very clear that this person has received, this expectant or birth mother has received as much possible support leading up to that decision. So while it might seem extreme that it's irrevocable, there's a lot that went into that decision. So it's not being rushed. And specifically, I had a very unique case where the child was born in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia. Mother at the time was incarcerated, so reached out to the hospital social worker and said, I'd like to speak with an agency. They called a particular agency. That agency was licensed in both Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And there were multiple meetings with mom about the choice of law, the pros and cons of both, about counseling. And ultimately, mom chose Jersey because she wanted that irrevocability and wanted to be able to then, after she was discharged, to go back to incarceration, to do what she needed to do there and know that she was moving on and making the best possible decision for her child. Now, where that case went a little bit off the rails was grandmother intervened, and that's a whole other conversation. But because of the fact that there was so much done leading up to the irrevocable relinquishment, it was really ironclad, and it was very hard when grandmother contested those surrenders to prove that mother didn't know what she was doing and didn't have the most informed possible decision-making behind that process. And the only reason I brought up the cost was not to talk about the average cost in general, but it's also a factor in our decision-making when you're choosing law and venue. So Pennsylvania does not allow us to provide expenses for birth mother, whereas at all, it is not legal to provide that. That's not to say people don't do it. That's just very hush hush. It's really not allowed. The idea is we don't want people coerced, or enticed with finances and to get sucked into that. But in New Jersey, you are permitted to provide expenses. And that can be for maternity clothes. It can be for medical expenses. It can be for groceries. It can be for keeping the lights on and the utilities running in her home. And that's much more liberal in New Jersey as well. So that's another reason why often birth mothers will select New Jersey because of that option.
Is there a cap in New Jersey of how much you can spend for birth mother expenses?
I believe it's just reasonable. So whatever that may be, from what I've seen clients do is just paying for prenatal vitamins and organic groceries to giving, a couple months of rent because mom would have been homeless otherwise. Keeping a cell phone plan on, getting the medical insurance when they didn't have it. So that's usually where we're at. Now, if somebody was giving, just 50 grand in cash, I think that would raise the flag of the court and the judiciary.
And just worth mentioning, in some states, even though there's a quote unquote cap, they can get that increased by appealing it or, and showing the need. So sometimes it's very fluid.
Yeah, I think it's very wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Like, I don't think that that's something that we, which is why I think, again, Pennsylvania was like, I'm not touching this at all, or we're not going to touch this at all, but people do it behind the scenes. And another really important distinction that I think is important for both, pieces of the triad is in Pennsylvania, post-adoption contract agreements, PACAs, are enforceable. So it's our version in Pennsylvania of an open adoption. So you're able to detail whether it's going to be quarterly updates and photos, in-person visits, level of contact. You're able to put that in an agreement that is then a court order that's binding and enforceable. Across the bridge in New Jersey, we don't have that. I mean, you can put one in place, but they're not enforceable should that, come to play, and you need to enforce it through the courts. They're not enforceable.
Awesome. And for those of you listening that don't know what a post-adoption agreement is, I'm going to link in the show notes back to a conversation I had with Linda Sexton, where she gave a whole example in her book, and I read it through. I think it's worth going back and listening to. Let's talk about legally enforceable. What does that look like if I am a birth mother and the adoptive parents who adopted my baby are not following through on what they said they were going to do?
Yeah, that's really great to raise. So ultimately, you would be, as the birth mother, filing to enforce that post-adoption contact agreement. And what you would have to show to the court is that there was this agreement, that everybody entered into that agreement knowingly, voluntarily, and freely, but there was no coercion in any way, no duress, and that agreement articulated specifics that you wanted to see. Now, if you're trying to say, oh, they're not sending me the quarterly photos, but they're sending them to me, twice a year, is that necessarily something you're going to take back to court to enforce? Probably not. But this is more relevant in scenarios where we're talking about actual open contact. This comes up, I think, at least in my experience, where there's siblings in a case. And the courts in Pennsylvania tend to err on the side of this is an enforceable family court document. So we are strong with contract principle in Pennsylvania. So the parties intending to enter into that contract and the principles of contract law apply. And they're going to be upheld in those situations. But again, it's going to be on the party who is alleging that someone's not following the agreement to prove that that's what has been happening.
Have you seen something like this happen where a birth mother takes it and contests it? And
No, to be honest. So I've only had a few post-adoption contract agreements even put into place. One of them that I did was specifically because birth mother had 3 other children whom she wanted the twins that were being adopted to still have contact with. And my clients were moving and relocating to Ireland. So they were not going to be local where, they were originally intending to be. So we did put into place a plan. However, things change, flights become, untenable to pay for. In that situation, I think birth mother was not understanding the true logistics of getting her other children onto a plane and that kind of thing. So we modified our agreement to more so that when my clients came back to the Philadelphia area, because they did still have family here, that they were obligated to reach out to birth mother. And they started doing so every time they came back, which was about once a year. And birth mother really fell off. She was consistent those first couple of years. And then after that, it was harder and harder for them to get in touch with her. So I think sort of something similar to what we were talking about, where irrevocability is enticing. Sometimes it becomes too emotional for the birth mother to continue that contact. Yeah. Even though when they intend to do it for the sake of the siblings. There is actually an agency in our area here who I think this is a lovely idea. They host a huge picnic annually so that birth parents and adoptive parents can come and everybody can participate and everybody can see each other. And it's actually a requirement of working with their agency that you will, that you will engage in that level of openness. So that's another thing that people can consider when choosing an agency, if they do or don't want that level of openness. So it sets an expectation ahead of time. But no, I really don't see court action on these contracts.
Yeah, I asked if in the off chance that you have, but I've never heard of any either. What I would say is if you agree to something, have integrity and follow through, and don't even make it come into question. But it was interesting that you brought up that if something like moving to Ireland, and I actually did have clients also who moved to Ireland, that you can get it modified. I never considered that before.
Right. And I think the intent behind their agreement was because they were all going to be local in Philadelphia. And then when this change happened, they were already connected and entrenched enough. They didn't want it to derail the adoptive process. So I think it wouldn't have necessarily been a same consideration had Ireland been on the table at the very beginning. But again, it was the integrity of my clients saying, look, we know this wasn't what you intended. We know we want to continue contact. We'll do as best as we possibly can to make that happen.
Yeah. And I think there needs to be that kind of language in every PACA.
Yeah.
PACA or PACA?
I always say PACA.
Okay. I think there needs to be language like that in all of them, because sometimes I find that the language that agencies uses are so cut and dry, like you have to agree to a visit every single year. Mm-hmm. Is there room in there that if something happens, if you lose a job, if you can't afford, if mom's actively using drugs, like that language, I think needs to be in these agreements because it's way more reasonable.
100%, 100%. And I think you just hit on a big piece. What if there's a safety reason why there should not be contact with child and birth mother? Mm-hmm. So very often, unfortunately, if mother had a substance abuse problem, and that's part of the reason why she chose to place, then there has to be parameters around that. And I think in my experience, I actually had a kinship adoption where aunt and uncle were adopting 3 children, and father and mother both had extreme substance abuse issues. And while they wanted connection for the children with their biological, parents, they were unwilling to enter into any kind of formal agreement, because even though we had drafted specific language like that, they weren't sure that it was going to be upheld. And also they weren't sure what if they showed up at the intended visit and dad was high at that visit? How would they be able to navigate terminating that visit? Would the children still see him in that state? So they really would not enter into anything official because of that, even with those parameters.
Yeah, I think that's hard for some parents. I mean, I had a client once who's like, I can't sign it the way it's written because if I miss 1 year, I feel like I'm not, living up to my agreement. And that feels like it gives me no leeway, like if something should happen. And I agree. Yeah. I think it's too cut and dry sometimes. And there needs to be room for a conversation for that kind of wording to go in. Now, we talked earlier in the conversation, you had brought up if there was a situation with 3 different states. So let's say the family who's adopting is from New Jersey. The agency that they are adopting from is in Georgia, and the mom lives in Florida. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that kind of a situation, because it's not uncommon. I mean, it happens a fair amount of time. And does anybody need to be concerned? What laws are followed? What does somebody need to know about that?
Yeah. So in our law here in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey, you are allowed to finalize the adoption where the agency is licensed, where the birth mother resides, where the child will be born or is born, and or where the adoptive parents reside. Now, most often, and this is for my clients being the adoptive parents, they want to finalize in their home state. They want to do it there, so it's convenient. Especially if there's another state where the child is born, they want to finalize the interstate compact, bring it all back to New Jersey or Pennsylvania and finalize it all here. Also, very often they've already started working with me, and I'm only licensed in 2 states, so they want to make sure that they're sticking with that. But what I always recommend is consult with an attorney, or I will consult with an attorney with you in those other states to talk through choice of law. And that's exactly what we did in my other case that I mentioned in California. My clients had hired an attorney in California to talk them through what the process would look like in California versus doing the process here in New Jersey. And it became very clear that we needed to do so here in New Jersey because there was some caveat that would allow for intervention in California that we were very worried about grandparents being able to take advantage of. So we wanted to, shift here to New Jersey as a result. So I think it's very important to know the law in your home state, but then also understand what does that law look like in those other places to make that consideration, and finding local counsel there. And usually if I'm working with an agency that's maybe based in Georgia, they've got local counsel that they have relationships with, so they can recommend either for me and my clients to speak with and talk through that. But it's absolutely smart to make a decision based on what you're being advised on through your attorney, not necessarily just what's best for the agency or best for birth mom, but what you as the adoptive, parent or party are going to feel comfortable with.
Yeah. And sometimes that's tricky because sometimes agencies kind of put their foot down and say, you are going to have to finalize here. This is just the way we're doing it. And nobody's going to argue that. And technically, you really don't have to. You can use whatever lawyer you want to finalize. Yep. So I'm not always quite sure what's in it for them to do it that way. But there is, like you mentioned, in New Jersey, you can finalize anywhere. In Pennsylvania, you can finalize anywhere. Some states, you don't have the option to finalize somewhere else. And usually, if an agency is going to work with you for an adoption, they are going to know what the law is, because they need to know that before they know if they can even work with you.
Right. So. And there's an adoption attorney who works out of Florida, and he has a listserv that he circulates, potential matches. And all of those potential match packets include what it looks like to finalize in Florida. Right. So that's something that my clients have always wondered about when I send them those potential match resources is, well, do I have to do it down there or can I do it here? And similarly, there's an agency that I work with that's slightly north of Philadelphia and the counties surrounding Philadelphia that I work in. And they typically like to work and finalize there in that particular county. And they are totally fine with me, though, when I bring a client to them. If that client wants to finalize in their home county, totally fine. There's no questions asked about that. They just think, hey, we have this great relationship with the court here. We're based here. Let us do it for you. But if you have your own attorney and you want to do it where you're based, totally fine as well.
Yeah, I'd say that's the best bet. Have your attorney call the agency and just say, hey, let's work together. But you bring up a point too, as far as the listserv, and I happen to know who you're talking about. But in the case where you are adopting through an attorney, and in some states that's legal, some states that's not. I don't believe in Jersey or Pennsylvania as an attorney you can facilitate adoptions.
No.
But in some states you can. And in that case, I don't really see a reason to pay, because the fees include finalization. So if you're going to finalize back in your home state, you're going to pay an extra fee that you don't have to pay for. And typically finalizations are happening over Zoom. So rarely do you ever have to travel back to that state. But if anything, that's the worst. So you have to kind of look at, does it cost us more to travel back to the state or to just hire an attorney back in my own state?
Yeah, I agree. And in that particular situation, I advise my clients to just go with that plan, especially because it sort of is soup to nuts. It's not, like you said, it's facilitation of the full process, which we cannot do here in Jersey or Pennsylvania, but it's really laid out well, and it almost would be more disruptive to sort of take a piece of that well-oiled machine out. I think not only is it more costly, but I think part of the way that that attorney has set everything up is there's a very specific and clear timeline that I think works really well in those scenarios.
Interesting. You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, and I'm not sure if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but that you have this niche and you're kind of known for contested adoptions. I hate to think that there's that many that can keep your business thriving, but give us some scenarios of why an adoption might be contested.
Sure. I think that there's two specific scenarios that I've encountered. The one that's the most prevalent is grandparent intervention. So
yeah. Can they intervene? Do they have a legal right? You mentioned that before, and I was like, how can a grandparent contest?
It's very interesting. So it spans multiple sections of our court and sometimes multiple states. So one of the particular cases that I had was my client was very clear that she was unable to care for twins that were coming. She already had a 2-year-old and wanted to focus on that 2-year-old. They had some special needs. So they contracted with an agency here, did everything that they, needed to do, did all of the pre-counseling, matched with a lovely family, and got ready to proceed in that arena. They filed, they elected, despite everyone being in Philadelphia, they elected New Jersey law because that agency was licensed in New Jersey. Mm-hmm. And that birth mother felt like it was the best thing for her to relinquish and be done with that emotional decision. But what happened was they filed the adoption, say, February 1st. Well, 7 days after that, when grandmother and aunt found out that that was what was happening, they filed a petition for custody in the Philadelphia Family Court. And what they were saying in custody court was, A, we have standing to intervene and we have a claim for custody of this child. And their hope is that the custody action thwarts the adoption action. So then what happens for me is I come in and I file an answer and a counterclaim to dismiss their action in custody, indicating that they don't have standing. And I also file something that are called preliminary objections. So what I'm basically saying is not only are you wrong if you're able to file to intervene, but you actually can't even intervene because you don't have standing here anymore. And one of the benefits to this process when it starts in New Jersey is that ultimately when we file the adoption complaint there, we get something called a preliminary and final order, and that effectively terminates parental rights. So if parental rights are terminated, grandmother's no longer grandmother legally. So we've made that argument in several situations. Pennsylvania has some carve-outs for standing, but ultimately what it does is it starts this conversation not only between the two states, but also about which is first in time. Is it the adoption? Is it the custody matter? And it's really been interesting and novel in both of those states. One of those ended up becoming a 9-day trial, which was very intense. The other one, the 9-day trial is still pending on appeal here in New Jersey. But the one that I mentioned with the twins, the judge agreed with me that there was a clear intention for mom to relinquish her rights, that there was no standing at that time for grandmother and aunt, and that the custody action was actually dismissed outright. And so the adoption was permitted to proceed. Now, in the other case I mentioned, grandmother took it a step further and filed to invalidate the surrenders that mother had signed in New Jersey. In the first case I mentioned, grandmother didn't have the savvy or the understanding of knowing to do that, but in the second case they did. So what it came down to was a determination of, were those surrenders valid, and did mother have the capacity at the time she signed those surrenders to do so? I've seen a lot of contested cases where it's father who's contesting.
Yeah.
He maybe has been MIA for years and years and years, when we ultimately serve him with the paperwork, something about his, something goes off, like an ego. I don't want to, have my rights terminated, even though I've never met this child before. And in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, they have a constitutional right to free appointed counsel. So it triggers a whole different process. And when somebody's getting free counsel, they think, well, sure, why not? I'll take this opportunity. But they still have to prove that for the period of time, 6 months prior to the filing of the adoption pleading, that they were providing parental care and control of this child. Very often they're not able to do that, but it's my responsibility to put on a case that shows that it's been adoptive parents or the kinship resource or step parent who is, really stepping in as parent there. And very often those do succeed. The ones that don't are when we have a judge that doesn't understand the law or, is new on the bench or thinks that this is a case that it's not. But like I said, it's those two scenarios, grandmother or dad who's been MIA and comes back around once served. Interesting.
Gosh, I'm sure you have stories upon stories. Are there any trends in the legal world as adoption goes that would be important to know about? Is there such a thing?
Yeah, there is. I mean, at the end of the day, family court looks at what's in the best interest of the child.
Right.
So even if dad is able to say yes, so specifically in Pennsylvania law, we have 2 sections of our law that when someone is looking to terminate parental rights involuntarily, when somebody contests, you have to meet both. It's not just a one or the other. So they have to show that they have provided that parental care and control and that it would not be detrimental to the best interest of that child to sever the bond with that other placing resource. So while you may be able to say, yes, I, send a couple cards on birthdays and Christmas, but then the next, piece of it fails because you're not able to show that it would be, in that child's best interest to be removed from the home that he or she is only known for, 9 years or so. Yeah. So that's the I don't want to say it's a trend because it's always been best interest standard, but that's something that we're really starting to see become like a really strong foothold.
Good.
Yeah.
I'm happy to, I think that's important because I'm actually talking with somebody now about that same thing. It's like, if this goes on long enough and the child is with you for 8 months, isn't that, in some ways, maybe that's good for you because it's in the best interest of the child not to move them.
Well, right. And in one of the cases that I mentioned where we had that 9-day trial, the child is 4. The child was placed at birth. At birth. Wow. And now has only ever known the adoptive parent.
Can you imagine?
And that's one of the things that we've been trying to impress upon grandmother is that there's really going to be a huge detriment to this child if they're ripped from this home. And grandmother has said multiple times that really she just wants some partial time with the child, which everyone has agreed to. Yeah. But I think she doesn't quite understand the nuance of that and what that means. And again, I think that there is some pride involved in the situation as well. And yeah, like I said, we're waiting on the appeal. The judge in New Jersey found that the adoption could proceed, that the surrenders were valid, and that's being appealed by grandmother right now.
Wow. So for those who are seeking out an adoption attorney for their adoption journey, where would you advise that they look if they don't have someone like me to guide them? And what questions should they ask to make sure that it's a good fit for them?
That's a really great question. I think the first thing that they should do is ask for trusted referrals. Yes. I never suggest just Googling because there's too many attorneys out there who put ads out that aren't necessarily knowledgeable practitioners, but start by asking, like if you're in, a prospective adoptive parents Facebook group or, you have a friend that went through the process, start there. But then of course you can start to Google, but I would be very, very, very careful and cautious about reading reviews because an attorney can put out whatever he or she wants, on the internet, but the reviews are really going to show you where to go. and what's true. But I also would recommend interviewing attorneys, talking to them about their experience, talking to them about their attention and knowledge and involvement in the adoption community. I think there are some attorneys that practice, like I said, family law, which is like divorce, custody support, and think they'll take an adoption case here and there, but they truly don't know the nuance. Mm-hmm. So you're going to want to talk to somebody who actually understands. And by that, I mean, ask them how many cases that they've managed. Ask them if they're familiar with the lingo and the requirements and the law. Ask them how long they've been practicing too. I think that that's super important. Also, the vibe that I try to give to my clients is I'm not selling you something. I'm trying to support you. So if you're getting a vibe from an attorney that they're salesman-y or sticky or anything like that, that's usually a red flag for a lot of people. You're going to want to ask them about cost. I think that's another thing. The ethical attorneys that manage the adoption process for families, we have sort of an understanding about costs and fees. Typically, if somebody is gouging you, it's because they're charging you for their learning curve. And we want to stay away from that as well. Another big thing is talk to them about their communication style. I hate when I hear a client coming to me after having worked with another attorney where that attorney just ghosted them or ignored them or didn't answer their questions or communicate with them in an effective way. So talk to the attorney that you're interviewing about their communication style. And get a realistic understanding for timeline and for cost as much as you can, so that and feel like you're getting good answers. An attorney who just says, "Oh, don't worry about it, I'll take care of it," isn't necessarily giving you the right expectations or the right, understanding of the process.
Wise advice, Diana Schimmel. Wise advice.
Thanks.
I always kind of wrap up with a series of questions, and my first is, who is a person or is there an organization that has really impacted your adoption, the world of adoption for you?
Yes. So it's a judge, actually.
Let's shout them out.
I will shout out Judge Linda Einen of the Camden County Superior Court. She is I've been practicing now 14 years. I've practiced in multiple jurisdictions and multiple different, levels of court. And she is hands down the best judge. And why I think that is she handles a ton of adoption work, but she's human. She understands. She looks at each case uniquely, and she doesn't just put a one-size-fits-all spin on it. She's been instrumental in my particular career because I have a lot of cases with her. I have a lot of cases with her staff. Mm-hmm. She will pick up the phone and call me personally. She really pays attention to the detail. If we have a contested situation, I trust that she has taken notes, is following along, is reading the transcripts. I think that she understands at the end of the day that this is about the child at the center of all of this. And the other thing too is she gives a lot of respect, not just to the attorneys practicing before her, but to all of the parties that are a part of these cases, both sides. And I think some judges get a little bit egotistical or haughty and aren't as deferential or friendly to the parties. And she made sure that absolutely everyone felt comfortable in her courtroom at every moment that we were there. And I think that speaks volumes about her character. Yes.
That was a new toy I've never used, but that was so good.
Shout her out. Yeah.
Is there a book or a podcast, it doesn't have to be adoption related, that you are listening to right now that you love?
That's so funny. I wouldn't necessarily say that it would be adoption related because typically in my free time, I like to do things that are as far away from law and adoption as possible. But I will say this, Angela Tucker, who is a Black woman who was adopted by a white family. and from the foster care system, she wrote an amazing book about it. Yes. And she did a movie as well. We are actually hosting a event with her to come and speak in October through a collaboration between the Family Law Section and the Adoption Subcommittee in Philadelphia and Temple University Law School. She's extremely dynamic, and I think that's a really relevant topic right now, and her book is fantastic. So I would recommend Angela Tucker.
Yes, it's called You Should Be Grateful, and I am reading that book right now and highlighting as I go. It's great. What's one of the biggest lessons you've learned?
Oh, wow. The biggest lessons I've learned is not to take anything for granted, especially not my own children. I think that it is really rewarding to watch somebody build their family through the adoption process, but it is also really important to understand that it's not easy, not successful, and that I really shouldn't take anything for granted, whether it's thinking I have a slam dunk of a case, whether it's thinking that an adoption is going to happen, whether it's thinking that we are going to be healthy and happy and, have everyday promise, but it's really just not to take everything for granted.
Love it. Describe adoption in 3 words.
Ooh. Wow. Adoption in 3 words. I'd say empowering, heartwarming, and modern.
Attorney Diana Schimmel, thank you so much for being part of the Adoption Roadmap podcast. If you liked what you heard today, please give it a 5-star rating and follow us for all of our episodes. We come out every Wednesday and Friday. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode of the Adoption Roadmap podcast. If you did, I have a few favors to ask of you. First, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And while you're at it, I'd love to hear your takeaways. Please write a review and let me know what you liked. And if you have a question or a suggestion on what you'd like to hear, I'd love to hear that too. Please shoot me an email at support@rgadoptionconsulting.com and let me know what you'd like to hear about. And if you have a question, I may just answer it online. Thanks again for listening. Tune in every Wednesday and Friday morning for a brand new episode of the Adoption Roadmap podcast. Until next time, bye-bye.